like we could all use some inspiring stories now. And it is always a pleasure to hear from David Davis. Please join me in welcoming him now.
Thanks, Marilyn, and thanks to Beverly Hills Library. Thanks to Alice, Max, and Karen, and of course, Marilyn. I've done a couple of these talks with you guys. It'd be great to see you in person, of course, but I appreciate you giving me some Zoom time with everybody. I'm a big fan of libraries, as everybody knows. Card-carrying member of many, many libraries in Southern California. So please support your public libraries. Despite the fact that I'm very, I guess, handicapped, I'll use that word, with technology, I'm gonna try to show some nice photos as well, and a couple video clips. Both of them have some sound. I hope that comes through, but just to give you a little bit of a warning. So if you see me futzing around, that's me trying to get the photos, the images up. But first, just a little background on the book and the story, which is sort of how did wheelchair sports come about? And it turns out it was from the paralyzed veterans from World War II. That's the short answer. And to go in depth a little bit is just as background, and before I start showing some photos, before World War II, paraplegia was basically a death sentence for the most part. If you were in, let's say, a mining accident, or if you were fighting in World War I and were wounded, chances are you were going to be dead. The mortality rate for veterans of World War I who had paraplegia was about 80 to 90% within about 18 months. And that was because it was disease, sepsis, infection. And the medical community didn't have the wherewithal to combat that. And there was no such thing as penicillin, sulfa drugs, that sort of thing. So that was the situation going into the 20s. In the 30s, you have a game changer. You have penicillin, the advent of penicillin, and the distribution and proliferation of vast amounts of penicillin. You also have the sulfa drugs on the battlefield in World War II, so that medics right on the battlefield could attend to wounded soldiers and staunch their wounds. You had surgical theaters right behind the front lines, and you had better evacuation. Think about World War I, there was no such thing as really aviation. If you had to evacuate wounded men, I mean, it's a long ocean liner voyage from Europe back in World War I. World War II, of course, we've got the Pacific and Europe. So they were able to evacuate the men a little bit quicker, oftentimes, of course, using airplanes. So the bottom line was, in contrast to World War I, in contrast to the 20s, where the medical community had no hope to save the lives of paraplegics, World War II, you had about 2,500 US servicemen who returned home with a future, a chance of life. And yet we didn't really know how to take care of that. There were no ramps to public buildings. Think about handicapped parking spaces, all of that sort of thing, accessible bathrooms. None of those existed. And so that was part of the puzzle of what was going to happen with these 2,500 or so veterans. And the VA basically had a challenge, which was to say, you've got 2,500 young men coming home. What are you going to do with them? If like in the past, they were going to be confined to institutions, that would mean a hefty tab for taxpayers. Think about, 2,500 young men living for 50 years in a VA hospital. So it behooved them to get these men up and moving and rehabilitated. And that was the word. And they actually said, some of the doctors said, we want to have these men become taxpayers. And that was sort of the ultimate goal, to get them back into society. And the good news was, coming home from World War II, there was quite a bit of, whether you want to call it patriotism or nationalism, but certainly there was a lot of respect for veterans, and certainly for wounded veterans. And President Truman was in the Oval Office at that point. He was himself a veteran. Many members of Congress had served, and they were behind the veterans in terms of, let's get them up, let's get them rehabilitated. So that's the situation. One of the first moves that the VA made, and I'll start showing some photos in a sec, but one of the first moves that they made, the VA, so Truman appointed General Omar Bradley to run the VA at this time. And Bradley, of course, had been quite a bit of a hero during World War II. He had the men's, he wanted to make sure the veterans got the best care they could. What he did in consultation with the specialist was to set up 7 spinal cord injury units across the country at VA hospitals. There were also 2 units of spinal cord injury at naval hospitals. And I'll go into one of them in Southern California in a second. And also with the VA, it was in Southern California as well. So those were, in a sense, the first time only that we had this unit devoted only to spinal cord injuries. So that was a huge advancement. The doctors themselves used innovative treatments. They had the men do vocational training so that they can get jobs. There were watchmaking, watch repair. They were trying to figure out how men in wheelchairs could go into society, into mainstream society, hold down a job, maybe have a family and have kids. So it was a vast puzzle that they had to come to terms with. And part of it, and I'm going to start showing a couple photos. Part of it was, how do wounded men, paralyzed men, how do they get around? Wheelchair technology, let's show what wheelchair technology, and I'm putting those in air quotes. Let's see what that looked like back then. Okay, there's a photo. And you can see those huge front wheels, and all of which is to say, these have really nothing to do with something called mobility. The terminology back then was wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. And basically what that meant was these men couldn't really use that wheelchair. You couldn't put that wheelchair, fold that up and put it in a car or anything like that. You couldn't really use that to roll down the street to a job or to go to a restaurant or a public building. So that was part of the puzzle. And thankfully, right before the war, there had been some technology of wheelchairs. And I'm going to show you, before I show you that, let me show you this one. This is let's see. This is actually shot in England. This is the spinal cord unit that was happening at the same time as we were doing it here in the United States. This is at Stoke Mandeville outside London. And I'm showing this for a couple reasons, just to take a look at those wheelchairs. Basically, they're lazy boys on wheels. And again, they don't fold. It's impossible to sort of move them around. And maybe I'll come back to that, but that particular shot, that was the sport that they undertook, which is called netball. And it's a sort of a cousin of wheelchair basketball. And as the story goes, it evolved into basketball, but this is in England. And so they were doing things a little bit differently in terms of sports. But I just really wanted to show you the wheelchairs on that one. And I'm going to show you one other wheelchair as well. And let's see, that's, sorry, hang on a second. Okay, here's the other wheelchair I want to show you. And this is, of course, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, until 1945. And you can see that sort of old school wheelchair. And the reason I wanted to show you this photo speaks to beyond sort of the technology, which is to say the stigma of disability, the stigma of paraplegia before World War II, and something, again, that the men were sort of up against. And this is a very, very rare shot of FDR in his wheelchair. It happens to be at his sort of, I guess, his home away from the White House. It's a very informal shot with his dog on his lap and a friend's daughter. And FDR, according to his biographers, took great pains to avoid being photographed in his wheelchair. He understood the stigma against disability. There were laws called ugly laws against people with disability. And Roosevelt who had contracted polio in the 1920s before he was elected president for his first term. He rarely allowed himself to be photographed because he understood that that was a sign of weakness, or that's what he thought it was. And certainly that's what society viewed it as. So again, I just wanted to show you that because we'll see a contrast of that as the men start getting into rehabilitation and sort of moving on with their lives. And one of the things that these doctors at the VA, and I want to sort of localize this a little bit maybe by talking about the two hubs in Southern California for people with paraplegia. One was at the Birmingham VA Hospital in Van Nuys, and that was under the leadership of Dr. Ernest Boers, who becomes very, very famous for his treatment and rehabilitation techniques with paraplegia. And of course, there was the Naval Hospital in Norco in Corona, and a gentleman here who's in our audience, Kevin Bash, was an invaluable source and resource in terms of research. He's done quite a bit. And that Naval Hospital was also a hub of paraplegia research for the wounded veterans. And I mentioned, so there was vocational training, there was exercises, and let me show you a photos of, sorry, let me get this exercise photo up here. Let's see. Yeah, let's see if I can share that one. Okay. Yeah, so there's some exercising with paraplegia. And again, this is the first time that they're undertaking this. Before, if they were institutionalized, they were put in full body plaster casts. Again, because the doctors had considered them to be dead enders and no hopers. Now they wanted to get them moving. And a big part of this, as you can see, is strengthening the upper body, the chest, the shoulders, the arms, forearms, wrists, because that's going to propel the wheelchair. That's going to get them out, the paralyzed veterans, out of bed and getting involved in their getting into their wheelchair and then getting involved in society. You can also see on some of the men by their ankles, they've got some braces on, and you can see the crutches in the foreground. They were, and when you see the movie clip in a little bit, They were very hopeful. They wanted the veterans to get up and quote unquote walk and use the crutches and use these braces. And FDR did that a lot. When he would have public speeches, he would put on his braces and usually be escorted by somebody to a podium. But these braces were very, very uncomfortable. And most of the veterans preferred the wheelchair, as a matter of fact. But I wanted to show you that. And beyond the exercises, it soon morphed into something more than just exercises. And that, of course, becomes wheelchair basketball. And I want to share this screen. Let's see. Yes, let's do that. And I'm going to share this. And this was, I love this photo. This is one of the earliest examples of wheelchair basketball. This is at Birmingham Hospital in Van Nuys. And I want you to notice, hopefully, a couple things, specifically the wheelchairs. And if you can see, they put the front wheels in the back. And these were, and we'll show you a better photo in terms of how they folded up and so forth. These were foldable. These were maneuverable. They weighed about half as much as those big clunky ones I showed you before. And for whatever reason, they worked well with basketball, at least certainly in the beginning years. This was the state-of-the-art wheelchair in sports for, quite frankly, decades, until I would say late 60s, early 70s, when the athletes themselves started to take control of wheelchairs and so forth. And just on a side note, obviously we're talking local. These wheelchairs were invented here in Southern California. They're called Everest and Jennings, E&Js. They still exist. The company still is around. Mr. Everest was actually disabled himself. He was in a mining accident. He and another engineer put these together, in part because Everest couldn't go anywhere with his old wheelchair. He wanted to go out and get jobs and work. And this is his invention. And as it turned out, it worked great for basketball. And it's sort of weird because when you think of basketball, we think of, you think of height. You think of Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, people running up and down the court. And, height is an important factor. Interestingly, basketball worked great, maybe better than most sports, with wheelchairs. Obviously, you got a flat surface. It's big enough to accommodate, 10 wheelchairs and players, and it can be played at all seasons. So it was interesting how that came about. There was some controversy as to whether to keep the basket at 10 feet and whether they should lower it. And the veterans apparently fought to keep it at 10 feet. They wanted to keep that height, and so they did. And just a couple other quick notes on basketball itself. Again, it's about strengthening the shoulders, the upper body, which is so helpful for those with paraplegia. And then sort of getting beyond just the physical, it was really a psychological boost for these men. It really was a touch, and you think back, these are young men in their 20s. They've had their lives inextricably changed because of their injury, and many were depressed when they came home and trying to figure out what to do in a world that wasn't accommodating to them, and in a world that really had very little experience with paraplegia. Sports brought a touch of normalcy to their lives, and fun, and a sweat. And I think that shows in, as the sport developed, it became super popular. So let's see, I want to show you another couple photos of that. And this one, I think Kevin will appreciate. I mentioned, so that was the Van Nuys team. These are the Rolling Devils from Naval Hospital Corona. And honestly, this was the inspiration for me to pursue this as a book. I heard the name Rolling Devils, and I said, I've got to know more about the Rolling Devils, because that's just such a great name. And it turns out this is one of the very first wheelchair basketball teams ever. This was at the Naval Hospital. So these are mostly Marines and or Navy. The gentleman in the middle with holding the ball is Johnny Winterholler. He was an outstanding athlete at the University of Wyoming before the war. These are to put sort of a human face on paraplegia and World War II veterans. Two of the men in this photo I write about in the book. One was Johnny Winterholler. As I mentioned, he was a star athlete at Wyoming. He was sent to the Philippines actually in 1941 before Pearl Harbor. He was captured on Corregidor in early 1942. He was in POW camps in the Philippines for the remainder of the war until early 45. And he lost the use of his legs because of malnutrition and lack of medical care in the POW camps. He returned home, ended up at Naval Hospital Corona. Thankfully, was able to marry his high school and college sweetheart and start life anew. And he was, for a very short time, just probably the best wheelchair athlete the world had ever seen. The other gentleman I just want to point out on the far right with the smile and the number 1, that's Gene Jerry Fessenmeyer. And, this is obviously Veterans Day is Wednesday. So I pay tribute to Jerry. He was still alive when I started writing this book, and Kevin was nice enough to help put me in touch with him. He was living in Texas. I went down to interview him. He was one of the last surviving members of these original teams. He did pass away during the writing of the book. Just a little background, he was sort of an Iowa farm boy, and he joined the Marines, literally left the stage at his high school graduation and joined the Marines. He told me that he was being trained for the invasion of Japan, the home islands, if that was to come about in 1945. Of course, President Truman decided to drop the atomic bombs instead. But Gene was shot by a Japanese sniper on the island of Okinawa. And that's how he incurred his injury. And he came back, he told me he came back, he weighed about 70 pounds. And basically everybody thought he was going to die. He had dozens of surgeries. He had bed sores upon bed sores, which was a scourge of paraplegia. But he managed to survive. And he always told me that, playing basketball was just a way to get back into society, get back into the norm. And the Rolling Devils and the Flying Wheels, as the team from Van Nuys became known, are two, well, the Rolling Devils ended up being a short-lived team, and I'll tell you more about the Flying Wheels in a second. But these are two of the pioneering wheelchair basketball teams, and sort of everything that comes from, in terms of sports for people with disabilities, comes from these teams and the others in the VA hospitals. Okay, I will stop sharing that photo. And just to show you, yeah, okay, I'll hold off on that photo. The team from, I'm sorry, that window popped up on me. Okay, that's better. The team from Van Nuys ended up being the catalyst for wheelchair basketball to spread across the nation. As I said, the Rolling Devils were sort of short-lived. They did a road trip up to Oakland that was incredibly successful. But it was the Flying Wheels, as they became known, who sort of took wheelchair basketball on the road. And I'm going to show you, again, I'm going to show you a photo of the Flying Wheels as they're getting ready to take off for their first road trip. And you can see, this is at Burbank, by the way, and they had chartered this plane. And this is the team before they're getting on to, this is spring of 1948, or late winter, early spring of 1948. And so take a look at how do you get these men onto the plane? Frankly, people in wheelchairs had never flown before, okay? So here's what they did to get them onto the plane. Let me grab this photo. Sorry for the, let's see, let's share this. Okay. Let's see. So they got a forklift. They put them on, they rolled them onto planks and then into the entrance. And then they would carry the men to their seats and fold up those wheelchairs. So that's the glamorous life of the first wheelchair basketball team. But it was a super important road trip. And I want to show you, well, let me show you this. This is our friend Jerry, or Gene Fessenmeyer, when the Rolling Devils had their short-lived trip. This is how he came off the plane. Again, see the ramp, and it was a little bit different back then. Okay. Thank you, and thanks for bearing with me on my technology here. We're starting to get there. As I mentioned, the Flying Wheels went across country and played all of the other wheelchair basketball teams that were popping up in the VA hospitals. They would also play college and professional teams who would borrow wheelchairs for the occasion. And it was an interesting thing, because here you had people with disabilities in their wheelchairs being incredibly athletic, showing off their skills and beating the quote unquote able-bodied teams using borrowed wheelchairs. So it was something to see. And I want to show you the success of this on the road trips. Well, this actually is the, just to show you, I mean, people were very supportive of these men. Here's the Oakland Tribune articles about the Devils when they went up to Oakland to play a semi-pro team. Just written about all over the place. And then I want to show you another, here we go. Let's see, we can share that one. Here's Newsweek magazine, as you can see, 1948, and March 1948. And I mean, let's just say this, not to denigrate our President Roosevelt, but he would never do this. He would never pose for a photo in his wheelchair for the cover of Newsweek. Here you have Jack Gerhardt from the Halloran team, on a VA team on Staten Island, showing off his uniform, his E&J wheelchair, and showing how tough he is, and that he's ready. And you can see the headline on the bottom, Paraplegics, the conquest of unconquerable odds. So this is sort of a moment in time when these men sort of caught the attention of the public, the medical community, the media, and as I'll show you in a minute, the politicians as well. So I showed you that. I'm going to show you this other screen. Okay, now this is going to be a real test of, all right, let's see if we can do this. Yeah, okay, I'm going to show you. This is the game. This is footage from Madison Square Garden. And that gentleman that you just saw on the cover of Newsweek is in this game. This is one of the earliest games ever that you'll ever see of wheelchair basketball. It's March of 1948. The rules are very, and there's no sound on this, by the way, so just FYI. It's very sort of crude. The rules that went into effect are not being used here. It's just sort of a free-for-all. But you can see there's 15,000 people in the stands here. This was in newsreels. This was shown in newsreels all over, and you can see the audience, and maybe right here you can see lined with people in wheelchairs, and that was Jack Gerhardt on the pass. Okay, I'm gonna click that off. Yeah, and so it was an amazing thing. And when we talk about publicity, or you have to talk about Hollywood, and being that Birmingham hospital, the VA hospital, was so close to Hollywood, all of this attention, the cover of Newsweek, the newsreels, all of the newspaper, magazine articles, I mean, they were written about from the Daily Worker, the communist newspaper, to Popular Mechanics. And of course, Hollywood took notice, right? And here is a movie that a lot of people have not seen or heard of, called The Men. And it's basically the story of these men in the VA hospitals. And this is a 2-minute clip from YouTube. The star of the movie is Marlon Brando. It's his first starring role in a movie, Hollywood movie. There's some great stuff it's in the book, great anecdotes of Brando shooting this movie while he was in Hollywood. He stayed at his grandmother's place in Echo Park. And this was shot in part at Birmingham Hospital in Van Nuys. And Brando hung out with the men and went drinking with them, that sort of thing. So this is a scene of him doing rehab at the hospital. And there is some music, so I'm just going to let it roll. It's about 2 minutes.
Walk out of here. But I'm going to be married standing up.
Okay, now you'll see this is how they get, that's that E&J wheelchair, and watch him getting into his car. Boom, and he folds it up. These were specially adapted cars. You'll see, these are the hand controls, so paraplegics could drive away, go to a job. I'm going to pause this just for a second. This is a fully accessible house for paraplegics. Again, they fought for disability rights. This is a house that somebody in a wheelchair could use. There were ramps. The bathroom was accessible, that sort of thing. The doorways were widened for the wheelchairs. So I'll let it go. Obviously, very romantic scene here. And of course, some basketball. And just so you know, they used real life veterans, paraplegics, as extras in this movie. Also water basketball as well. Okay, and of course, Marlon Brando being able to show off his upper body, I'm sure was one of the reasons he was very happy to take that role. And some of us are very glad that he did, yes. Anyway, and unfortunately, that movie really sunk at the box office. It apparently, it came out or it opened right as the Korean War started. And according to the producers, that was sort of the death knell for this movie, which was, let's just say, quite dark. It has a sort of a happy ending, but not totally. But it's not like some of the other, World War II fare that came out of Hollywood, which was obviously a lot more patriotic and upbeat in terms of the ending. So that was sort of the high water mark. And I want to show you a couple more photos. And then, please, if you have questions, please fire away. I love the questions. I mentioned the Flying Wheels road trips. And I mentioned, of course, how they were lobbying for disability rights. Well, here's a photo showing that. Here they are when they would play the team in Richmond, Virginia. They would always stop at the Capitol and lobby congressmen and women for rights. This actually was the woman you can see behind them, standing behind them. She's got the autograph there. She was a congresswoman from Massachusetts, and very instrumental in helping in veterans' rights and veterans legislation, as a matter of fact. I'll just show you another photo as well, when they're in the, again, in their trips. This is from, as you can see, 1955. The Flying Wheels, they did this trip every year from, I think it was 48 to about 1958. And again, they would stop in the White House or Congress. And obviously, Eisenhower was pleased and gracious enough to see the man. In terms of, I guess, what we would call legacy, I'll talk a few minutes and then I'll show you a couple other photos. And again, if you have some questions, I'm happy to take them. The VA hospitals, they did their job with these paralyzed veterans. These men were, those 2,500 men, most of them did survive and live, whether it was long lives or just an extended life. The statistics are hard to come by, of course, but from everything I've read, the majority made it through. They all had medical issues for years, as a matter of fact, and needed surgeries and would have bed sores and have to go in. But so it wasn't just, okay, you're up and going and everything's great. There was a lot of complications, and it wasn't all easy by any stretch. But once the men were released into or once they released themselves and went into society, took jobs, started families, wheelchair basketball, which is to say para sports, extended beyond just the veterans communities. They were called hometown teams or whatever, however you want to call them. And they would come out in cities, and oftentimes led by veterans in the beginning, and then slowly maybe the veterans would start doing their jobs and didn't have time for it. But they opened the doors. And so the next wave would be those with polio. In the late 40s, early 50s, of course, we still had the scourge of polio epidemic. And I see Terry down here, Terry Luxemburger, who was kind enough to get in touch with me today, said he had polio, and they became part of the scene of wheelchair sports. Amputees were also welcomed. And so it sort of spread beyond the veterans and spread beyond paraplegia. At the same time as this was going on, I think I mentioned, we showed that photo of what was happening in England. At the same time this was happening, you have the gentleman over there, Dr. Ludwig Guttmann, is starting his own version of sports and sports contests. And by the mid 50s, the United States is sending a team over to these games in England. And sure enough, that's really the start of the Paralympics. And most people date the first Paralympic Games to Rome, 1960. And that's sort of the first official Paralympics, because it followed on the heels of the 1960 Rome Olympics a couple weeks later. There was no direct affiliation between them at that time. But that was the start of putting, and Dr. Guttmann was an incredible self-promoter. And that was sort of the start of putting that idea in the broader sports community of linking the Olympics with the Paralympics. And I'll show you one photo from that was the second wave of the Paralympics. And that's Dr. Guttmann on the right, the far right. This is the Crown Prince and Crown Princess of Japan. And this is Tokyo 1964. And this is the second official Paralympics. The book, The Wheels of Courage, basically the narrative goes up to this date, to 1964. Obviously, the book came out, we were planning to have it coincide with the 2020 Tokyo Paralympics. But of course, that didn't happen this year, right? Because of the pandemic, and it will be next year. But now it is official that the Olympics and the Paralympics are tied together, and that you can't bid for the Olympics without also providing for the Paralympic Games. So that's one of the great legacies of this greatest generation, these wheelchair athletes. And I want to show you sort of the other part of it as well. Let me share this one. And this photo jumps ahead to 1984 at the Los Angeles Olympics. And this is Sharon Hedrick. And there were two exhibitions at the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. Two wheelchair events, one for men and one for women, on the track at the Coliseum. And by that time, wheelchair sports had evolved beyond just basketball and netball and archery, sort of those early sports, which were so important, for the rehabilitation of the men. But as I said, it expanded beyond veterans, and the United States was actually a little bit late in terms of introducing women into the fold of wheelchair sports. But they eventually did come. And she's still alive. She's a well decorated athlete at Paralympics. And just to be clear, we did not have a Paralympics at the 1984 Olympic Games. We just had those two exhibitions. There was a lot of snafu, which I go into a little bit in the book, but suffice it to say, this was a big moment because here the Paralympians or the Paris athletes are sharing the same track, the same stage as Carl Lewis and everybody like that. And just again, on a local level, This photograph was from the Los Angeles Public Library collection. They have a great collection, and just want to point that out. There's some good people over there, and their Olympic images are great. So in a sense, that's ultimately the legacy, several legacies, that these paralyzed veterans opened the door for sports for people with disabilities, which of course extended to women, to youth, to other disabilities, including intellectual, as we know. And the other reason to show this photo is to look at the wheelchair again, and not to drive that point too much, but those old E&Js were just standard wheelchairs. And really, again, we talked about, this was about rehabilitation. At a certain stage, the athletes took over in this realm, and they understood their bodies better than the doctors did. And they understood what would work better mechanically for wheelchair sports. So this is sort of one of the first beginnings of this new technology, super light and adaptable, better for disability. And when we hopefully will have the good full schedule in 2021, both for the Olympics and for the Paralympics, and you'll see every sport has sort of its own design of wheelchair, and that in and of itself is super fascinating in terms of development. Okay, so I'm gonna yeah, okay. So let's see. Looks like we have a couple questions. Let me take a look at this. Sorry, I'm just looking at this for the first time. From Susan to everyone: how much influence on overall wheelchair design and functionality are attributed to? Such a good question. That's sort of what we were talking about, I guess. Design and functionality, absolutely. So you're going to have different wheelchairs if you're a marathon racer versus quad rugby versus wheelchair basketball. And I'm not the most well researched on the modern games. This is more history that basically goes to the early 80s, but certainly I've read about and looked at modern wheelchairs, and it's absolutely about functionality. People, disabled people who ski have a whole different set of equipment, of course. And there's it's called the Abilities Expo, and it's something that travels around the country. It's in Los Angeles, the big cities. Obviously now with the pandemic, they're not functioning right now, but that's a great, I've been going to the Abilities Expo for the last several years, and you can see all of the different implements and wheelchairs and styles that people use. There's a crew in LA, I think they're called the Rockettes, and they're a dance crew. And so they have their own wheelchairs that they use for dancing. So yeah, great question. Thank you, Susan. All right, let me look at the second one from Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. In your research for the book, was there anything particularly shocking or surprising that you learned? I guess I would say everything. How's that? No, in all seriousness, I knew very little about this topic going into the research. I stumbled across this because of the team out of Norco in Corona, the Rolling Devils. And, my background is journalism. I sort of stumble into the rabbit hole, and you just start going into it and into it and into it. And yeah, everything was sort of shocking and surprising. And just on a very basic level, I went to archives in England to look at Dr. Gutman's papers. I went to University of Illinois, the archives there, because Timothy Nugent was a groundbreaking innovator in terms of wheelchair basketball, and he was the key linchpin in sort of taking it from the veterans to the rest of the world. So I went to see his archives. I went to St. Louis to research the veterans. That's where their medical records and their military records are. And then, of course, interviews by phone and up and down California. I guess to me, the shocking, surprising thing was just literally that wheelchair sports started with paralyzed veterans from World War II, something I just did not know about. So that's what I spent 4 years researching and writing. So let's see. Okay, another. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, let's see, from Susan. Shocking how long it took to pass ADA. Yes, knowing how much was needed. Looks like, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think these men and what they sort of started was the opening salvo in the long march for the ADA. And there's a specific connection that I write in the book that happened at the Tokyo Paralympics in 1964. A gentleman there named Justin Dart, who many in the disability community will know that name, Justin Dart Jr. He happened to be in Japan. He was an American expat in Japan, and he saw the Paralympics, was energized by that. When he returned home to the States, he became a disability advocate, and he was one of the driving forces behind the ADA in 1990. And in fact, when you look at the photo, excuse me, of President George H.W. Bush signing ADA 1990, Justin Dart is sitting in his wheelchair next to him. And there is a connection with how he first saw the Paralympics and these athletes. And so it's very interesting. Yes, sorry, Carolyn. How long did the team stay organized? Did any of the men? Yeah, so the Rolling Devils, as I mentioned, unfortunately, were a short-lived team. The Flying Wheels, oh my gosh, they became sort of let's just say the Lakers of wheelchair basketball. Some of the greatest athletes who ever played were on the Flying Wheels for years. I should mention the Birmingham VA was moved to Long Beach in 1950. It was very controversial. Many residents and actually the veterans themselves who had settled in the San Fernando Valley and built homes to be near the VA in Van Nuys were very upset by this move. But that Long Beach hospital, the VA, is still there, and the Flying Wheels sort of represented Long Beach for all those years. So yes, many of them did end up playing top elite level basketball. They were on teams that went to Stoke Mandeville in England before the Paralympics were invented, and also were on the USA team 1960, 1964, which were very small teams, but well represented. Let's see, Kevin Bash, yes. Let's see, Don Stowe, yes, was still alive. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, absolutely. There were a lot of men, so there were the doctors, of course, doing the rehabilitation, but there were many men and women behind the scenes to help, whether it was nurses, physical therapists, coaches, that sort of thing, who really took these men and worked with them and gave them the green light, so to speak, to be athletes, to try this, because it was so brand new. So I guess on that note, we've been here a while. I've bored you enough, but I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming and sitting in. Thank you to Beverly Hills Public Library. I'm a card-carrying member, even though I'm not in Beverly Hills, but I really appreciate all the services you do. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Some great chat. I was trying to type. I can't type and talk at the same time, but This is wonderful to work with David as always, and we're so glad that so many of you joined us, and some great questions really showed that your stories that you shared with us tonight touched a nerve. So just so happy that all of you joined us, and hope you'll read the book or hunt down a copy of it somewhere.
I won't be upset if you borrow it from the library. I borrow a lot of books from the library, and that's okay. I appreciate that.
Well, I saw that our copy just came in and it's already on the hold shelf,
Excellent.
but we do have an ebook as well. So check it out, as they say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good to see everybody. Familiar
you.
faces.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.